You ever about to die and then God says, "F you"? I'd like to talk about a pocket of time where the Nintendo DS just refused to die. Nintendo handhelds generally go through this a lot. Oh, the 3DS went through this. You see, pretty much every handheld system Nintendo puts out is a success in one way or another, and because of that, when its successor comes out, Nintendo wants to make sure its predecessor still has some support going on for it. I guess it's because, hey, Nintendo handhelds are generally cheap. Many of them are seen as starter video game consoles for youngins out there. So when the brand new handheld comes out for a bit of a more expensive asking price, they generally drop the price of the predecessor and keep that around for a little bit, kind of as a starter introduction system. And they'll still have games come out for that because in many cases, its successor is also backwards compatible. Big example is the Game Boy Advance. That still had games released for it well into 2005, over a year after the Nintendo DS launched. I mean, we got The Legend of Zelda the Minish Cap in 2005 for the Game Boy Advance. I mean, that's like one of the defining titles on that handheld, and it came out after the DS launched. And more recently, the Nintendo 3DS just refused to die when the Nintendo Switch released. This one is pretty understandable. The Nintendo Switch is this giant new leap for Nintendo. A home console and handheld in one. The implication here is that we won't need two separate Nintendo systems going forward. But the handhelds are what's always successful with Nintendo. Just getting rid of that and having one dedicated system, I mean, that's a bit of a risk. So they kept the 3DS alive well into the Switch's lifespan, kind of as a fail-safe, like, hey, we know this handheld was successful, we have to keep games coming out for it because, hey, if the Nintendo Switch bombs, the Nintendo Switch is going to fucking bomb and will ruin our company. So keep the 3DS alive, make sure it still has games coming out for it, so if the Switch fails, we can always just go back to the 3DS and then do a Nintendo 3DS 2 or something. Thankfully, that never happened. So unthankfully, we had like 2 years where we were getting 3DS games and we were like, why the hell is this handheld still getting games? But you know what? We felt the exact same way about the Nintendo DS. So, it's the year 2011, and the Nintendo 3DS has just launched in North America in March. At this point, the Nintendo DS is about to turn 7 years old. It's crazy to think about, but that damn handheld launched in late 2004. Now, for me personally, I didn't even really know the DS was a thing until the Nintendo DS Lite released in 2006. And when I look at the whole timeline of the original DS's life, things feel like really fragmented. It kind of feels like 2004 never existed. 2005, a lot of the heavy hitter games released, like Mario Kart DS and Nintendogs. But that was still during the era in which the DS looked like not the DS. In 2006, we got the DS Lite. Now, that's the DS I remember. And the whole marketing shifted around then. It became all about casual garbage. Brain Age, Big Brain Academy, personal trainer, cooking, math, crosswords DS. Like, it was all of this stuff along with this incredibly casual-looking, sleek, white portable. And after that, we got stuff like The Legend of Zelda, Phantom Hourglass, got a sequel to that in 2009, Spirit Tracks. Honestly, like, looking at the entire DS's life, kind of almost feels like it kind of ran out of steam around 2008 or so. Like, all of the big, heavy-hitting, most iconic DS games, I feel released before, like, 2008, 2007. Anything after that, like, I can name some games, like I just said, Spirit Tracks, there was WarioWare DIY, but I feel like that's because I'm primarily looking at it from a Nintendo first-party standpoint. When we look at what Nintendo themselves published on the DS, I'm gonna be quite frank here. Nintendo was not at their first-party peak on the handheld. I think the DS is as good as it is because of the third-party support. And it's kind of the other way around for the 3DS. I think Nintendo's first-party output on the 3DS is magnificent. Third-party-wise, there's not as much going on here. And when we look at what Nintendo was pumping out on the DS after 2007, like, I'm gonna be frank, they weren't doing much at all with this thing at that point. Feels like they outgrew the DS. I mean, they had to release this updated revision, the Nintendo DSi, in 2008 in Japan and spring of 2009 in other regions. And that gave the DS a bit of a boost, but I don't know. It was obvious we kind of needed a successor at this point. this thing was getting old. So we finally got one in March of 2011, and it was rushed out the door. The 3DS launch lineup was horrible. I mean, you had content here. I mean, you could make do with it. Super Street Fighter 4 3D Edition is a wonder port on this thing. Like, it's incredible they were able to get this on the 3DS, and it works really well. But Street Fighter is one of those things, like, you're either into it or you're not. And if you're not into Street Fighter, you're not really gonna get much out of that one. And if you are into Street Fighter, Super Street Fighter 4 on the 3DS is a little more leaning towards novelty rather than like, oh my god, this is gonna be my new go-to video game experience right here, bucko. Nintendo's output was laughable. I mean, you had Pilot Wings Resort, which is okay, you know, I think you can get some good times out of that, but it's a very one and done, like you can get through it very quickly kind of game. Steel Diver, which it's fucking Steel Diver. I don't think it's bad, but it shouldn't have been a retail 3DS game, that's for damn sure. That's the kind of game that is so light on content, the only time you can actually put it out is at the launch of a system when people will buy whatever the hell, because they just want to validate the purchase they just made. And Nintendogs plus cats, and I think Nintendo was really hedging on that game being the killer app for the 3DS. I mean, look how well Nintendogs did on the DS. Oops! Yeah, Nintendogs was a great time back when I was like 10 and it was 2007 and it was like, wow, I've never seen anything like this. I just wasn't really begging for a more refined, graphically intense experience here with cats. Ridge Racer 3D was okay. Monkey Ball 3D, again, it was okay. There just really wasn't much going on here, man. The 3DS launch lineup felt very much like the types of games you'd see for the DS in 2004. Most of these games were incredibly shallow. They had barely any content, any extra modes. I feel like the average length of all of these games was like 3 hours. Like, these games were incredibly short. So that was pretty damn insulting. But you know what else was insulting? That very same month the 3DS launched, Pokemon Black and White came out for the DS. My lord, like you have literally like, oh my god, a brand new mainline Pokemon game release. The same month, this system's successor launches. What the hell, man? I mean, okay, let's be fair here. DS games are playable on the 3DS. I don't think DS games look all too amazing on the 3DS, but I mean, they're still more than playable. They're all just a little too blurry, you know? Like, it feels like they're kind of stretched out and they're not playing at the right resolution. And the only way you can play them at the right resolution is when you boot the game up on the 3DS, like you hold a button combination down, and then they're literally the size of a postage stamp on screen. Either way, I'm not having a good time playing DS games on the 3DS, but you could do it if you wanted to. So I don't think this was as dire as like the 3DS versus Nintendo Switch situation, where it's like sometimes the 3DS would be getting games that I would have vastly preferred on the Nintendo Switch. Stuff like the Mario and Luigi Superstar Saga remake, Metroid Samus Returns, Luigi's Mansion remake, and there was no solution to that other than boot up your 3DS again, buddy. Now here, Pokemon Black and White released on the DS, and you could play them on the 3DS later that month. But just the fact that these are DS games was kind of disappointing. You have this fancy new hardware where the games actually look on par with like the GameCube or the Nintendo Wii. We have a widescreen display, cool new features like a gyroscope, 3D cameras, and on top of that, yeah, a 3D display. And there's a lot of elements of Pokemon Black and White that would have been pretty slick with a 3D effect. And could you imagine a Nintendo handheld with a Pokemon game as its launch title? Like, that would be insane. However, Pokemon Black and White were developed as DS games, and generally speaking, Pokemon likes to go for the platforms with the largest install base. And yeah, you compare like a 100+ million units install base of the DS to the 0 of the 3DS, and like, yeah, it makes sense. Like, hey, tough shit, you can play Pokemon on your 3DS if you really want to via backwards compatibility. So whatever, a little disappointing, but hey, I think Pokemon Black and White made for an incredibly fitting swan song for the DS line of systems. But if they weren't, I wouldn't have anything to talk about here, now wouldn't I? After the launch of the 3DS, there was like nothing on this system until like June of that year. So from March to June, like you would get like these little bites of things, you know, like Tom Clancy's Splinter Cell 3D, Cartoon Network Punch Time Explosion. I mean, I'm stretching here. Barely anything was releasing, and barely anything was of note or of a high enough quality to really give a damn about it. It wasn't until June when we got Ocarina of Time 3D, and not only that, but the Nintendo eShop actually launched for the 3DS via a system update. Yeah, the eShop was not a part of this handheld at launch. The Nintendo DSi launched with a shop application already. What the hell was the problem here? It just might have been a little more complicated than the DSi shop. They also wanted to make sure most DSiWare applications and games were available on the 3DS eShop, so there might have been a lot of work that had to go into migrating all of that over. I don't know. It was still pathetic as hell. But you know what they did to commemorate this? And alongside that, Zelda's 25th anniversary, The Legend of Zelda 4 Swords Anniversary Edition, available for free on DSiWare. I can't really complain about this because it's like, hey, here's a freebie for DS and 3DS owners. It's the original 4 Swords game that released on Game Boy Advance, bundled with A Link to the Past. And being a DSiWare game made it so then there was a higher probability you could actually play this game with multiple people. If they just made this a 3DS eShop exclusive, then you could only play it with other 3DS owners. Of which there were none available at the time. Nobody had bought a 3DS at this point, so having it available on both made it so then, hey, a DSi owner could download the game, a 3DS owner could download the game, and then you could play together via wireless multiplayer. That's all fine and good, it's whatever, and one of the coolest little freebies Nintendo's ever thrown at us. The original 4 Swords, have at it. That was pretty sick. But hey, the 3DS was actually starting to gain a bit of momentum here. I mean, we got Ocarina of Time 3D. Sure, it was a remake, but it's one of the greatest games of all time. Things were looking up for this handheld. Until a month later when Nintendo frantically slashed the price of it, begging people, please, please, please buy a 3DS now. Yeah, so this thing launching for $250 didn't really pan out as well as Nintendo had hoped. So they slashed the price to about $170, which I believe was probably going to be the original asking price of it, and then they probably bumped it up to $250 because they thought, oh, well, it's a glasses-free 3D display. People eat that shit up. Like, yeah, it's cool, but I mean, 3D was already kind of on the downfall at this point. Like, 3D was exciting for like one moment when Avatar released in like late 2009, and like people were kind of starting to think like, oh man, maybe 3D is the next big thing. So like maybe you'd go to a 3D movie here or there. But then I think most people kind of accepted the fact that like, I don't need this in my life, man. Like, it can be kind of cool, but like, this doesn't add anything. And in fact, if anything, it gives me a headache. Now, with that being said, the 3DS's 3D display is one of the best implementations of stereoscopic 3D that's ever been available to a wide consumer base. It just works well. You don't need the glasses. You can adjust the intensity. It was incredibly well done and thought out. But thinking people would want to buy this for $250 because of it obviously didn't pan out. So they slashed the price, and they also gave 10 free NES and 10 free Game Boy Advance games to early adopters as an apology. But this was just the start of the 3DS's holiday season. We had known games like Mario Kart were coming out, a Mario 3D platformer, Star Fox 64 3D. I mean, as I said prior, things were looking up for the 3DS. Guess what happened? They started supporting the out of the DS. Yeah, okay, so let me clear this up. The 3DS had a pretty okay holiday season in 2011. You know, that price cut was kind of the start of things snowballing for the handheld, where it would kind of gradually gain momentum and people were actually like, yeah, sure, I'll buy into that. But then you look at all the games Nintendo was releasing for the DS and you just kind of wonder, like, where the hell was this all coming from? So in September of 2011, Nintendo published Dragon Quest Monsters Joker 2. Now that was already released in Japan at that point, so, you know, that was kind of just Nintendo localizing a game here in North America. But hey, when I think Dragon Quest on the DS, I do think Nintendo. It's kind of like how I think of Professor Layton when I think of Nintendo, even though Professor Layton isn't a Nintendo intellectual property. Nintendo just published the games in North America, But hey, I always kind of look at Layton as a Nintendo character. Speaking of which, we got a brand new Professor Layton game in North America in October of 2011 for the Nintendo DS. Professor Layton and the Last Spectre. Hey, the Professor Layton games are always a solid time, but not only is this like a full-blown Professor Layton game, there's another game included that's just a flat-out, full-blown RPG. And it's like, okay, that's just a DS game right there. What were we getting on 3DS at the time? Fucking Pokemon Rumble Blast. Yeah, the 3DS finally got its Pokemon game. It's fucking Pokemon Rumble. I hate Pokemon Rumble. I'll say it. I don't give a damn. I don't know of a single person who's like, you know what? You're being a little too harsh towards Pokemon Rumble. Do you ever realize like you might have been the first person to ever say a statement? I think I was for that one. So damn, I'll say it again. I'll be the first person and the second person to say this. I think you're being a little too harsh towards Pokemon Rumble. Yeah, okay, so you compare these two. The biggest Professor Layton game of all time, a 3DS version of a damn WiiWare game, and a Pokemon Rumble game at that. Fossil Fighters Champions released on the DS in November. I don't know anything about the Fossil Fighters games. I just know, like, Nintendo kept pumping them out. I think there's 3. There was 2 on the DS, the first one being just Fossil Fighters, and then the second one being released this year in November. And then there was a 3DS one, and, like, I don't see anybody talking about these games. It almost feels like Fossil Fighters, Nintendo wanted this to be kind of like a bit of a pseudo Pokemon game. I mean, everything about this game kind of screams to me, we really want this to be a TV show on Saturday mornings on 4Kids. But yeah, Fossil Fighters Champions, that's just a flat out Nintendo game. Like, that is a Nintendo published Nintendo game. Right alongside, you gotta be fucking kidding me. Yeah, the DS got a brand new Kirby game, while the 3DS got Star Fox 64 3D. God, we were suffering. I like Star Fox 64 3D, but again, like, it's like, at this point, we got Ocarina of Time 3D in June of 2011, and then we had to wait months for the next major Nintendo published game, and it was just Star Fox 64 3D. So it's just like we were getting nothing but these Nintendo 64 remakes, man. Whereas Kirby Mass Attack is an incredibly unique Kirby game. I wouldn't say it's like, wow, this is this huge release, you know, it's not like this huge mainline Kirby game, but it's definitely a very unique one that actually utilizes the Nintendo DS stylus. It's really cool, and a lot of people have pointed out how the name actually correlates with the European title for Kirby Squeak Squad, which was called Kirby Mouse Attack. So of course now we have a Kirby Mass Attack. Yeah, that's just so cute. Not cute enough for the 3DS apparently. Now of course, I'm not gonna act like any of these games are really these huge, massive games, because the 3DS was getting those in the form of Super Mario 3D Land and Mario Kart 7. And because those 2 games released later this year, everything just kind of fell into place for the handheld. I mean, you have a new Mario Kart, you have this brand new 3D Mario platformer that actually takes advantage of the 3D display and is really fun and is really addictive. Like, I love plowing through Mario 3D Land. It's just such like a junk food game at this point. Back then, it felt like this was like, oh my god, one of the greatest Mario games of all time. Now, we can clearly see it is one of the most generic Mario games of all time, but it's really, really fun. But the 3DS got the games that mattered. And hey, all these DS games that were launching, once again, you could play on the 3DS, but it was a little frustrating when the 3DS's games were pretty low in quantity. I mean, like, other than the games I've mentioned, like, Nintendo also put out Tetris Axis, okay, and that was like a huge step down from like the DS's Tetris game, Tetris DS. And even then, the DS also had Tetris Party Deluxe, which was really damn good too. And then Tetris Axis is just Tetris Axis. I mean, it's still Tetris, but like, goddamn, dude. Like, that was it. That was it for Nintendo's output on the 3DS in 2011. Of course, you did have the eShop games. Oh, Pushmo. Dear Pushmo. I love that game, and it was an eShop exclusive. And in addition, you also had all the Game Boy and Game Boy Color Virtual Console games. Things definitely picked up for this handheld. But it would have been really damn sweet if these DS games were coming to the 3DS instead. But like I said, you could play them, whatever. We're moving into 2012, where it's all about the 3DS all the time. Son of a bitch! Yeah, so early 2012, it was announced that we would be getting sequels to Pokemon Black and White as DS games again. For late 2012, we were still getting major, massive Nintendo first-party Nintendo DS games. What the hell? And then guess what? We got another Pokemon game. Pokemon Conquest was announced just for the DS for summer of 2012 as well. So we were getting these massive Pokemon games. Now, Pokemon Conquest is this Pokemon spin-off game that's actually a crossover between Nobunaga's Ambition and Pokemon. And that was actually announced in December of 2011, well into the 3DS's life. So, yeah, Pokemon was still pushing stuff out on the DS. Like I said, Pokemon does like to go for the handhelds with the biggest install base. It was just still kind of like, come on, guys. The first Black and White, I could understand being on the DS. The second, coming out on the DS a year and a half into the 3DS's life, that is crazy. You know what else is crazy? They were pumping out brand new colors for the DSi and DSi XL at this time. I remember in summer of 2012, Nintendo announced, hey, we have brand new colors of the original DSi. This one, right after they announced the 3DS XL, and they announced how it was coming out in red and blue colors, they announced regular DSis also coming out in red and blue colors. Like, why? Now at this time, the DSi was retailing for like $100. So yeah, like I said at the beginning, it's obvious what Nintendo was doing. The DS systems that were still available were kind of just like, hey, here are incredibly cheap handhelds. And hey, game development is just a wonderful, tricky little weird thing. Obviously, Pokemon probably felt the most comfortable putting stuff out on the original DS. I mean, like, hey, 150 million install base. Now, I think that's always stupid to talk about, like, be like, hey, like, this system sold 150 million units. Hey, like, that's a lot of people to sell the game to. I'm like, sure, but how many of those people are actually still playing their DSs? How many of those people bought multiple DSs? Like, I remember as a kid, I got the DS Lite and then I upgraded to the DSi. So yeah, there you go. Knock one off of the install base right there. Go from 154 million units sold to 153,999,900, you know. But it's obvious Pokemon Company likes to play it safe, and once they saw the kind of lackluster sales of the 3DS, it probably made a lot more sense for them to keep moving forward with games like Pokemon Conquest and Black and White 2 being just DS games, and being like, hey, you know, you can play them on here if you want to, we don't care. They did introduce a couple Pokemon things to the 3DS to kind of coincide with Black and White 2, like Pokemon Dream Radar on the eShop, the Pokedex 3D Pro, a couple things here and there, but it kind of felt like in 2012, like we were never gonna get a mainline Pokemon game for the 3DS. It was never gonna happen. Thankfully, 2012 was not a big year for the DS. It was obviously all winding down, and these Pokemon games were pretty much the last titles released for the handheld, at least by Nintendo themselves. By early 2013, they announced Pokemon X and Y for the 3DS. And that year ended up being, in my opinion, the best for the handheld. There was so much content releasing for it. And I think it just goes to show, hey, be patient. These kind of things happen. When a new system releases, Nintendo likes to support the old one for a little bit. At least when it comes to their handhelds. Their home consoles, they drop that shit like a dirty pair of socks. But hey, I'm almost kind of glad that the DS lasted a little bit into the 3DS's lifespan, because we got some of the best games for the handheld during that time. Pokemon Black and White 2 are generally considered some of the best of the series. Professor Layton and the Last Spectre is just this giant conglomerate of a release. Kirby Mass Attack is really cute, a really fun use of the DS's capabilities. And hey, the larger price cuts for these handhelds made it so then more people could experience like one of the greatest handhelds of all time. The DS was incredible. So yeah, it does make a lot of sense why the DS just refused to die that long into the 3DS's lifespan. But just because it makes sense, that doesn't mean I'm not still fucking pissed. Nintendo, how could you?